Lonely Mountain Man paid $1 for an abandoned shed. That's the talk on the street. But when he pried the door open, he didn't find busted boards and rusted nails. He found a girl alone, dressed like the saloon, eyes daring him to send her into the snow. Out here, $1 buys you almost nothing. But this time, it bought a secret every hard man in the valley would kill for. Snow falls thick. Hoofbeats echo down the frozen road. Men with gold in their pockets and a name on their lips are hunting her. And the man who never asked for company is the only one standing in their way. What's she hiding under all that defiance and worn cloth? Why would someone pay blood money to drag her back? When the storm breaks and the rifles come out, the shed won't be the only thing torn apart. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The late afternoon shadows stretched long across the snow-packed ground as Elias Boone made his way to the rickety shed at the edge of Gray Bluff. His boots crunched through the fresh powder, leaving deep tracks behind him. The $1 he'd paid for the structure seemed fair enough, maybe too fair, given the warped boards and the way the roof sagged in the middle like a tired horse's back. Wind whistled through gaps in the wooden slats as Elias approached. His weathered hands, calloused from years of working trap lines, gripped the frozen door handle. The hinges protested with a sharp screech as he forced it open, letting weak lamplight spill into the gloomy interior. His heart nearly stopped. There, leaning against the door frame, stood a heavy-set teenage girl. Her clothes were worn thin, far too revealing for the bitter cold. Despite her obvious vulnerability, her eyes narrowed at him with defensive fire, and her lips curled up. In what seemed like a practiced challenge, Elias quickly averted his gaze, his neck burning hot despite the winter chill. "What in tarnation are you doing in here, girl?" he demanded, keeping his voice gruff but careful. "Living here," she shot back, crossing her arms. "Name's Della Mae Carter, and this here's my home." Her chin lifted in defiance, but Elias caught the slight tremble in her voice. The snow began falling harder now, thick flakes catching in Della's dark hair. The wind picked up, driving icy particles through the shed's many gaps. Elias shifted uncomfortably, knowing he couldn't just walk away and leave her here. Not in this weather, not in that state of dress. "This ain't no proper place for anyone to live," he said finally, studying the rotting floorboards near his feet. "Especially not with winter coming on strong." Della's laugh was sharp and brittle as ice. "Well, it's what I got, mister. Unless you're fixing to run me out?" There was something in her tone, a weary readiness, like she'd been chased off before and was prepared to do it again. Elias rubbed his beard, mind working. The shed wasn't his concern. He'd only bought it for storage. But the girl, Lord above, she couldn't be more than 16. "Where's your folks?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Mama's dead," Della said flatly. "Stepfather's alive, but I ain't going back there." Her hand unconsciously touched her arm, and Elias noticed fading bruises beneath the thin sleeve. The snow fell thicker now, the wind driving it nearly sideways. Inside the shed, a draft stirred some loose papers in the corner. Elias could see Della trying not to shiver, her pride barely holding back the cold. "Listen here," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "I just bought this shed fair and square. Paid my $1 to Mr. Jenkins at the Mercantile." He paused, watching her face fall slightly. "But that don't mean I'm heartless enough to put you out in weather like this." Della's expression wavered between hope and suspicion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you can stay put for now," Elias replied, already shrugging out of his heavy wool coat. He held it out to her, careful to keep his distance. "At least until we figure something proper out." She stared at the coat like it might bite. "Her, why should I trust you?" "Because I gave you my word," Elias said simply. "And because that coat's worth more than this whole shed, so I'll be wanting it back." The ghost of a smile touched his lips, trying to ease her fear. After a long moment, Della reached out and took the coat. As she wrapped it around herself, Elias saw her shoulders relax just slightly, some of that defensive tension easing. "Much obliged," she murmured, the words barely audible above the wind. "I'll be back tomorrow," Elias said, already planning to bring food and proper blankets. "We'll sort this out then." He turned to go, then paused. "And Della May?" She looked up, still wary but listening. "That door's got a latch on the inside. Use it." With that, he stepped back into the swirling snow, leaving her with his coat and whatever small measure of trust she might be willing to give Dot as he trudged back toward town. The wind howling around him, Elias wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. He'd come to Gray Bluff to sell pelts and buy supplies, nothing more. Now he had a shed he didn't need and a responsibility he hadn't asked for. But the memory of those bruises on Della's arm and the way she'd stood her ground despite her fear told him he'd done the only thing he could. The snow continued to fall, erasing his tracks almost as quickly as he made them, while behind him, a single lamp burned in a broken-down shed, holding back the gathering dark. The snow had picked up, dusting Della May's dark hair with white flakes as Elias stood in the doorway of his newly purchased shed. "I asked what you're doing here," he repeated, his voice firm but not unkind. Della May crossed her arms tight across her chest, the thin fabric of her dress offering little protection against the cold. "Been living here since Pa left, about 3 months back," she declared, chin lifted in defiance. "This shed's mine, fair and square." Elias rubbed his beard, considering. This wasn't a situation for him to handle alone. "Come on," he said finally. "We're going to see the sheriff." "I ain't going nowhere with you," Della protested, but Elias noticed how she shivered in the strengthening wind. "Either walk with me proper, like, or I'll carry you," he warned. "Your choice." After a moment's hesitation, she fell into step beside him, her warm boots leaving shallow prints in the fresh snow. They made their way down Gray Bluff's main street, past the Mercantile where Elias had just spent his $1. The wooden sidewalks creaked under their feet as townsfolk stopped to stare at the odd pair, the grizzled trapper and the heavy-set girl in her revealing dress. The sheriff's office stood dark and empty, a hastily scrawled note tacked to the door. Elias leaned close to read it in the failing light. "Says he's out after rustlers," he muttered. "Won't be back for days." "Told you it was a waste of time," Della said, stamping her feet against the cold. "There's still Mr. Penwell," Elias said, turning toward the justice of the peace's office next door. They found Augustus Penwell slumped behind his desk, a half-empty whiskey bottle at his elbow. His bloodshot eyes focused on them with visible effort as Elias explained the situation, to their surprise. Penwell burst out laughing, his breath heavy with liquor. "Well now, Boone," he wheezed, "way I see it, that property's yours now, and so's what's in it." He grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "That includes any strays you found inside." Elias stood speechless, while Della May's face flushed red with anger. "I ain't property," she snapped. "Law's the law, girl," Penwell drawled, reaching for his bottle. "Might be the best thing ever happened to you, ending up with old Boone here. He's peculiar, but he ain't mean." Outside, the snow was falling harder, and the wind cut like a knife. Elias noticed Della May trembling, though she tried to hide it. Without a word, he steered them toward Ma Fletcher's diner across the street. Bell above the door jingled as they entered. Warm air wrapped around them, carrying the smell of coffee and fresh bread. "2 suppers," Elias told Ma Fletcher, who raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. They settled into a corner booth, away from curious eyes. When the food arrived, plates heaped with beans, cornbread, and sliced ham, Della fell on it like a starving wolf. Elias watched her devour every scrap, understanding now that she hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe weeks. "Those clothes," he said quietly when she'd slowed down enough to breathe. "Where'd you get them?" Della May wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Ruby at the Silver Slipper gave them to me," she admitted. "Said she was throwing them out anyway. Only things I got now." Elias frowned at the mention of the saloon girl's cast-offs, but kept his thoughts to himself. The girl needed proper clothes, that was certain, but that was a problem for another day. When they stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked them both backward. Snow swirled in the gathering darkness, and the temperature had dropped even further. Elias looked down at Della May, saw her arms wrapped tight around herself, and made a decision he knew he might regret. "Can't leave you in that shed tonight," he said gruffly. "You'll freeze solid." Hope flickered across her face, quickly replaced by suspicion. "Where then?" "Not a cabin, about a mile outside town," he said. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." She studied him for a long moment, weighing her options. The wind howled down the street, making the decision for her. "Just for tonight," she said finally. Elias nodded, already wondering what he'd do tomorrow. He couldn't keep her at his cabin long term. It wasn't proper, and besides, he valued his solitude. But he couldn't put her back in that shed either. As they walked toward the livery to collect his horse, he felt the weight of Penwell's words settling on his shoulders. By some twist of frontier law, this girl was now his responsibility. The snow continued to fall as they made their way through town. Two unlikely companions thrown together by circumstance, neither one certain of what tomorrow would bring. Back at the shed, Elias held his lantern high, casting yellow light across the cramped interior. Della May moved with purpose, gathering her meager possessions. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded a faded quilt, its patches worn thin from years of use. "That all you got?" Elias asked, watching her tuck a dented tin cup and a Bible into the quilt's folds. "All I need," she replied, clutching the bundle to her chest. The Bible's leather cover was cracked and peeling, but she handled it like it was made of gold. Outside, the snow fell heavier now, thick flakes dancing in the lantern's glow. Elias helped Della onto his horse, then took the reins to lead them on foot. The path to his cabin wound through the high country, a good hour's trek in fair weather. In this storm, it would take longer. They moved slowly through deepening drifts, their boots crunching in the fresh powder. Every few minutes, Elias glanced back, checking on his unexpected charge. Della May sat hunched in the saddle, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Her cheeks were flushed from exertion, but she didn't complain. The girl had grit. He had to give her that. When they passed the halfway point, marked by a lightning-struck pine, he heard her breathing grow labored. Still, she pressed on, gripping the saddle horn with determined fingers. "Not much further now," he called over his shoulder, slowing his pace to make it easier on her. The sun hung low on the horizon when they finally crested the last rise. Below them sat Elias's cabin, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the darkening sky. He'd banked the fire before heading to town, and the sight of that smoke promised warmth within. The cabin wasn't large, just one main room with a lean-to addition, but it was solid and well-maintained. Elias took pride in keeping things orderly, unlike some of the ramshackle homesteads scattered across the territory. Inside, the wood stove's glow filled the room with welcome heat. Della May stood just inside the door, her bundle still clutched tight, taking in the neat rows of hanging pelts, the swept wooden floor, the single bed tucked in the corner. "Need to set some rules," Elias said, hanging his coat on a peg. "First off, them clothes won't do. I've got some old shirts and pants. That'll keep you decent till we can get you proper things." Della's eyes narrowed. Ain't wearing no man's clothes. You'll wear what I give you, he said firmly. Second rule, we share the chores. You help with cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing. I can cook, she offered, her voice softer now. Mama taught me good before. She trailed off, blinking. Hard. Third rule, no sass. I took you in. Least you can do is show some respect. Della's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Elias busied himself with the stove, adding wood and setting a pot of beans to warm. The familiar tasks helped ease the strangeness of having another person in his space. They ate supper in silence, the wind rattling the shutters outside. Della Mae scraped her bowl clean, then sat staring into the fire, her shoulders hunched. Why can't you go home? Elias asked finally. The question had been nagging at him since the shed. Della's fingers twisted in her lap. Stepfather, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After Mama died last spring, he said it was my fault. Said if I hadn't been such a burden, wearing her down with my ways, she might have fought off the fever. The pain in her voice filled the small cabin. Elias remembered losing his own mother young, the weight of absence that never quite lifted. He threw me out 2 months ago, Della continued. Said he couldn't stand the sight of me. Found that shed empty, been there since. Elias didn't press for more. Some hurts were too fresh for telling. Instead, he showed her where to wash up, gave her one of his clean shirts to sleep in, and made sure she was settled in the bed before spreading his bedroll near the stove. The storm raged through the night, wind howling down the chimney and rattling the roof boards. Elias lay awake long after Della's breathing had settled into sleep, turning over the day's events in his mind. Come morning, he'd need to learn more about her stepfather, about her mother's death, about what brought a 16-year-old girl to hiding in a frozen shed. But for now, she was safe and warm, and that would have to be enough. As dawn's gray light filtered through the cabin's single window, Elias rose quietly to stoke the fire. The girl slept on, curled tight under his extra quilts, her face peaceful. For the first time since he'd found her. Whatever came next, he knew this morning would bring hard questions that needed answers. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Elias saddled his horse early, checking that Della was settled with enough firewood and food before heading to Gray Bluff for supplies. The town looked different in the harsh winter light, its weathered buildings hunched against the wind like old men bracing for a fight. At the mercantile, Elias was measuring out flour when the bell above the door jangled. 2 men stepped in, shaking snow from their coats. Something in their hard faces made him pause. They moved like wolves, scanning the store with predators' eyes. Looking for a girl, the taller one announced, not bothering with pleasantries. Heavy-set thing, dark hair, might have passed through recently. He pulled a gold piece from his vest pocket, letting it catch the light. Reward for anyone who's seen her. Elias kept his movements steady, pouring lamp oil into his tin. Lot of. Folks pass through Gray Bluff, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Can't say I've noticed anyone particular. The shorter man stepped closer, tobacco-stained teeth showing in what might have been a smile. Our pa's mighty worried. Just wants his girl home safe. That so? Elias tied his purchases into a bundle, keeping his face blank. Well, hope you find her then. The men lingered, watching him load his saddlebags. Their eyes followed him all the way down the street. Only when he was well past the town limits did Elias let his shoulders relax. Back at the cabin, Della had dinner bubbling on the stove, a thick stew that filled the small space with savory warmth. She looked different. In the calico dress he'd traded for in town last week, more like the girl she should be than the desperate creature he'd found in the shed. Need to talk, he said, hanging up his coat. He told her about the men, watching her face pale. Best keep away from the windows for a spell. Stay inside where it's safe. Della's hands trembled as she ladled stew into bowls. I know the men. she said quietly. "Wade and Tucker. They work for my stepfather." She set the bowls down harder than necessary, soup sloshing over the rims. "He won't stop looking till he finds me, or till I'm dead. Might prefer that, truth be told. He'd kill his own kin?" "Ain't his kin," Della spat. "Just his wife's burden, far as he's concerned. And now that Mama's gone..." She trailed off, staring into the fire dot, as if sensing the darkness of their conversation. Snow began falling again outside. Within hours, thick flakes obscured the world beyond the cabin windows. The storm lasted 3 days, sealing them in together. They fell into an easy rhythm during their confinement. Each morning, Elias chopped wood while Della kept the fire stoked and the cabin tidy. She proved skilled with a needle, mending his worn socks with tiny, even stitches. The calico dress suited her better than the tattered clothes she'd arrived in, lending her a quiet dignity. On the third night, as they washed dishes together in companionable silence, Della began to hum. The tune was familiar, an old hymn Elias hadn't heard in years. The words came back to him unbidden. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound... His hand stilled in the dishwater. The last time he'd heard that hymn, he'd been sitting in a small church back east, grief-raw from burying his wife and infant son. He'd walked out halfway through the service and never returned, turning his back on God and anything that spoke of mercy. But Della's clear voice held no bitterness, only a simple grace that filled the cabin like lamplight. She hummed through all the verses, her work never slowing. Elias stood frozen, memories washing over him like waves. Sarah's smile, the weight of his son in his arms, the peace he'd known before loss hollowed him out. When the last note faded, he realized his cheeks were wet. He turned away quickly, wiping his face with his sleeve. But Della had noticed. She touched his arm gently, then went back to drying dishes, offering him the kindness of pretending not to see. The snow continued falling outside, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The hymn hung in the air between them, a bridge across years of silence, connecting the man Elias had been to the one he'd become. He couldn't bring himself to speak of it, but as they finished the dishes, his movements were gentler, less guarded. That night, as Della settled into her bed and Elias spread his bedroll near the stove, the familiar tune echoed in his mind. For the first time in years, he didn't try to silence it. The storm finally broke after 5 days, leaving behind a pristine white landscape that sparkled under crisp morning sun. Elias stepped onto the porch, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Behind him, Della emerged wearing the thick wool coat he'd found stored in his trunk. "Reckon it's time you learned some proper winter skills," he said, leading the way to his trapline. The snow reached past their knees in places, making each step a challenge. Della's face grew red with effort, but she kept pace, refusing to complain. Elias found himself slowing his stride, not out of impatience, but consideration. "First thing about snares," he explained, demonstrating with practiced hands, "is knowing where to set them. See these tracks here?" He pointed to tiny impressions in the snow. "Rabbits been through regular. That's where you want to place your line." Della watched intently as he worked the wire into position. Her fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled her first attempts. But she kept at it, jaw set with determination, until she managed to set one properly. "Not bad," Elias nodded, noting how her face brightened at the simple praise. Over the next several days, they fell into a rhythm. Mornings began with Della sweeping the cabin clean while Elias chopped wood. She proved to be a decent cook, turning simple ingredients into filling meals that warmed them after long hours outside. "My ma taught me," she explained one evening, stirring a pot of beans. "Said a body needs good food to keep going, no matter what else is lacking." Elias noticed how she grew more confident with each successful task. The defensive edge in her voice softened. She worked steadily, neither lazy nor slow, as he'd heard townsfolk whisper. Her size made some things harder, but she adapted, finding her own ways to manage. On their fourth day checking trap lines, Elias spotted something that made him pause. A thin column of smoke rose in the distance, too far from any homestead he knew of. "That ain't right," he muttered, instinctively reaching for his rifle. "No one should be camping out there." Della's eyes widened with understanding. They hurried back to the cabin, taking a roundabout route and watching their backs. That evening, they kept their rifles close as they sat down to supper. The familiar routine of washing dishes seemed to loosen something in Della. She began talking about her mother, words spilling out like water from a cracked dam. "Ma wasn't like most folks," she said softly. "Never made me feel wrong for being big. Said God made all sorts, and trying to shame someone for how they're built was just pride talking." She scrubbed a plate harder than necessary. After she took sick, though, seemed like everyone in town had something mean to say. Called me lazy when I couldn't lift as much as the other girls. Slow when it took me longer to do things. She fell silent, blinking hard. Elias dried dishes quietly, giving her time. "You ain't either of those things," he finally said, his gruff voice gentle. "Seen you work dawn to dusk without complaint. Seen you learn things that took me years to master. Folks who say different ain't looking proper." Della ducked her head, but not before he caught the shine of tears in her eyes. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence. Light snow began falling as they prepared for bed, adding another layer to the deep drifts outside. The cabin glowed warm with lamplight, the air rich with the smell of drying venison hanging near the stove. Elias had shown her how to cut and season the meat properly, and rows of dark strips now swayed slightly in the heated air. By the end of the week, they had enough dried meat to last through the worst of winter. The woodpile stood tall. Against the cabin wall, logs stacked neat and solid. Inside, supplies were organized, repairs made, and every surface showed signs of Della's careful attention. Looking around one evening, Elias realized they'd built something more than just a shelter from winter. The cabin had become a fortress of sorts, not just against the cold, but against the harder things waiting beyond their door. In the lamplight, watching Della mend a torn shirt with sure, steady stitches, he felt an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling stove. They'd found their footing together, this odd pair thrown together by circumstance. Each day brought new proof that sometimes the best families were the ones you chose, not the ones you were born to. A week before Christmas, hoofbeats crunched through the crusty snow toward Elias's cabin. He grabbed his rifle, but Della's sharp eyes caught the distinctive black coat of a traveling preacher. Reverend Thomas Miller, the weathered man, introduced himself, dismounting with careful steps, making my rounds before the holiday. His kind eyes took in Della's presence without judgment. "Thought you might appreciate a prayer and news from town." Elias relaxed his grip on the rifle. "Suppose we could offer you some coffee." Inside, Della busied herself with the coffee pot while the men settled at the rough-hewn table. Steam rose from their cups as Reverend Miller shared his news. "Those riders that were asking after you," he said, glancing at Della, "headed south 3 days ago. Seems they lost interest in our little mining town." He wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "We're having a Christmas Eve service. Towns coming together proper-like. You both would be welcome." Della's face lit up like sunrise on fresh snow. She turned to Elias, hope written clear across her features. "Reckon we might manage that," Elias said slowly, watching how Della's shoulders straightened at his words. After the preacher left, Elias rode into town alone. At the mercantile, he traded his finest pelts for a plain brown dress and a pair of sturdy boots that would keep Della's feet warm on the ride to town. The shopkeeper's wife helped him choose, adding a length of red ribbon for Della's hair at no extra charge. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold. They set out early, Della wearing her new dress under her coat, the ribbon holding back her dark hair. The morning sun caught the frost on bare branches, making them sparkle like shrunk diamonds as they rode into Gray Bluff. Elias watched townspeople's reactions carefully. But where there had been whispers and sidelong glances before, now he saw only approving nods. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, even waved from her shop door. The little church glowed with lamplight, wreaths of pine and holly decorating its windows. Inside, the scents of beeswax candles and fresh greenery filled the air. Della sat straight back beside him, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she took in the Christmas decorations. Reverend Miller's sermon spoke of hope and new beginnings. When the congregation began Silent Night, Della's clear voice rose pure and strong among the others. Elias, who hadn't sung in years, found himself humming along, something long frozen in his chest beginning to thaw. Silent night, holy night, the voices lifted together, and Elias saw how Della belonged here, part of this community that had finally opened its arms to her. She was no longer the girl from the shed, but a young woman finding her place in the world. After the service, several families stopped to wish them Merry Christmas. Even Mr. Penwell, the justice of the peace, seemed sober and sincere in his greetings. Della's cheeks glowed with pleasure at each kind word. They rode home under a vast, star-studded sky. The northern lights danced green and silver above the mountains, as if heaven itself celebrated with them. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was comfortable, warmed by their shared sense of belonging. As they crested the last rise before home, Elias pulled his horse up short. Something was wrong. The cabin sat dark against the starlit snow, no welcoming smoke rising from the chimney. The stillness felt thick, unnatural. No crunch of settling wood, no night birds calling. "Stay here," he told Della, urging his horse forward. The peaceful warmth of the evening vanished like frost and sunlight, replaced by a familiar wariness that made him reach for his rifle. Elias dismounted and approached the cabin with his rifle ready. The door hung open, swaying slightly in the winter wind. His breath caught at the sight inside. Lamplight revealed a scene of deliberate destruction. Their home had been ransacked with cruel purpose. The chairs lay scattered like broken toys, one splintered beyond repair. Someone had yanked open every drawer and dumped the contents across the floor. His precious furs, carefully stored for spring trading, were strewn about like worthless rags. Even the Christmas decorations Della had, made from pine boughs, lay trampled and torn. But worst of all was the message. Deep knife cuts marred the inside of the door, forming crude letters that made Elias's blood run cold. "She's ours." No. The whispered word came from behind him. Della stood in the doorway, her face drained of color. She reached out to touch the carved letters with trembling fingers. "That's his writing, my stepfather's. I'd know it anywhere." Elias grabbed his spare rifle and extra ammunition. "Stay here. Keep your gun close." He circled the cabin, reading the story written in the snow. Multiple horses had approached from the north. The tracks led away into the trees, but in the failing light, he couldn't tell how fresh they were. Back inside, they worked silently to right what furniture could be saved. Della's hands shook as she gathered scattered clothing, but her movements were determined. She refused to let fear paralyze her. "We'll need to keep the lamps low tonight," Elias said, positioning himself near the window. "No sense making ourselves easy targets." Della nodded, clutching her rifle as she settled into the corner farthest from the windows. Neither spoke much as darkness settled over the cabin. The familiar creaks of the cabin seemed louder now, more threatening. Every snap of a frost-cracked branch made them tense. Elias didn't sleep. He kept watch through the night, mind churning over their options. The stepfather's message wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. The man wouldn't stop until he had Della back, and Elias had seen enough of life to know what that would mean for the girl. As dawn's gray light filtered through the windows, Elias had made his decision. They couldn't run. The stepfather would only follow. They would have to make their stand, but they needed to be smart about it. "I'm riding out to see a friend," he told Della as she stirred the breakfast fire to life. "Someone who might help us figure this out." "Who?" Della asked, her voice small but steady. "Henry Tall Elk. Used to scout for the army years back. Knows these mountains better than anyone living." Elias checked his rifle one more time. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me." The morning air bit sharp as Elias rode through the trees, following a trail few knew existed. He found Henry at his winter camp, smoking his pipe in the shelter of a south-facing overhang. "Thought you might come," Henry said, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Heard talk in town about strangers asking questions. Bad business." Elias dismounted, accepting the offered pipe. He explained the situation in detail, watching his old friend's expression grow grave. "This stepfather," Henry said finally, "he is snake dangerous. Not the kind to give up what he thinks is his." He tapped out his pipe thoughtfully. "You need the law on your side, friend. Real law, not that drunk Penwell. Nearest real law is Judge Matthews in the county seat," Elias said. "Days ride away if the weather holds. And your girl would be alone that long." Henry's dark eyes met his. "This man, he won't wait for law. He'll strike when he thinks you're weak." Elias nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. He had known taking in Della would complicate his life, but now he understood just how much. The simple act of showing kindness to an abandoned girl had set him on a path that could end in bloodshed. "What would you do?" he asked Henry. The old scout stood, stretching his back. "First, I would make sure the girl is safe. Then I would ride for the judge, but not alone." He smiled slightly. "Perhaps an experienced tracker might help speed the journey." Elias felt a surge of gratitude for his friend's loyalty. "Much obliged, Henry. But you're right about Della. I can't leave her unprotected while we're gone." "No," Henry agreed. "We must think on this carefully. A wrong move now could cost more than property." His expression hardened. "I have seen men like this stepfather before. They wear their cruelty like a badge of honor. They understand only strength." Together they stood in the crisp morning air, two old frontiersmen contemplating the best way to protect one young life from the darkness that threatened to claim it. Elias rode back to the cabin through the gathering dusk, his mind heavy with plans. The windows glowed with lamplight, and smoke curled from the chimney. He gave the signal whistle they'd arranged, waiting until Della's face appeared at the window before approaching Dot inside. He found their few belongings sorted into neat piles. Della had been busy. Food parcels wrapped in oilcloths, spare ammunition counted and divided, warm clothes folded and ready. "Been packing," she said simply, straightening from where she knelt by a canvas bag. "Figured we might need to leave quick-like." Elias nodded, impressed by her foresight. "Henry says we need to get to Judge Matthews in the county seat. He's the only law strong enough to stand against your stepfather." He hung his coat by the fire to dry. "I'm thinking you should stay at Henry's camp while I make the ride." Della's chin came up, her eyes flashing. "No, sir. I won't hide while you risk yourself on my account." She gestured to the packed supplies. "I can ride, and I can shoot. Whatever's coming, we face it together." Elias studied her determined face. The scared girl from the shed was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone willing to stand her ground. "It'll be dangerous," he warned. Your stepfather's men could be watching the trails. Then we'll need to be careful, she said firmly. But I'm going, Elias sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. All right, but we do this smart. We leave at first light tomorrow, travel quiet and watchful. They spent the evening checking their gear and planning their route. Della insisted on taking her mother's Bible, wrapped carefully in a clean cloth. Neither slept much that night, too aware of every sound in the darkness outside. Dawn painted the snow pink as they loaded their horses. Della wore the new boots Elias had traded for, along with every warm layer they could manage. They rode out, single file, Elias leading, watching for any sign of pursuit. The morning was bitter cold, their breath freezing in white clouds. They stopped at Henry's camp to warm up and share coffee. The old scout had his own horse saddled and ready. 3 rifles are better than 2, he said simply, checking his ammunition. Besides, I know some trails your stepfather's men won't think to watch. Della's eyes shone with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Tall Elk. Henry nodded, a slight smile touching his weathered face. Your mother's people believed in protecting the innocent. I am honored to help. They rode all day, Henry leading them through narrow valleys and across frozen streams. The snow was deep, slowing their progress. Sometimes they had to dismount and lead the horses through drifts up to their flanks. As the sun began to set, Henry guided them to a sheltered spot between 2 large rocks. They built a lean-to from pine boughs, gathered firewood, and made camp for the night. The horses stood close together for warmth, steam rising from their backs. Around the small fire, they ate jerky and hard biscuits. Della huddled in her blanket, staring into the flames. Something in her expression made Elias wait, sensing she had more to say. It ain't just meanness making him hunt me, she finally said, her voice low. Though he's mean enough, sure enough. She pulled her mother's Bible from inside her coat, opened it to reveal a folded paper tucked between the pages. It's this. He wants. What is it? Elias asked, though he had a feeling he knew. Deed to our homestead, Della said. The creek-bottom land where the water runs year-round. Ma put it in my name before she died, knowing what kind of man she'd married. She carefully refolded the paper. He was sure she'd leave it to him. When he found out she'd DIDN single quotes T. She trailed off, her hands trembling slightly. Henry nodded slowly. Good water in cattle country is worth more than gold. That's why he won't give up, Della continued. That land's worth a fortune to the right buyer. He offered to buy it from me, but I wouldn't sell. That land was Ma's dream. She wanted me to have a future there, running my own place someday. Her voice caught. Then he started getting rough, saying accidents happen to stubborn girls. Elias felt a cold anger settle in his chest. You did right to run. I had to hide in that shed because no one in town would stand against him, Della said. They all knew what he was doing, but they looked away. She met Elias's eyes. Except you. You didn't look away. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Henry added more wood, the sparks rising like stars into the dark sky. Get some rest, Elias finally said. Long ride tomorrow. They settled down to sleep, taking turns keeping watch through the night. The wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack. The rising sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink. Elias stamped his feet, trying to warm them as they prepared to break camp. Della wrapped the last of their biscuits in a cloth while Henry scattered the ashes of their fire, erasing signs of their presence. River's next, Henry said, squinting at the horizon. This'll be thick after these cold nights. They rode single file through the morning, Henry leading the way down from the high country. The horses' hooves crunched through the crusty snow, their breath steaming in the bitter air. By mid-morning, they reached the river crossing. But what they found made Elias's heart sink. The water ran black between sheets of ice, too dangerous to ford. Broken chunks crashed and ground against each other, the sound echoing off the canyon. Walls. One slip would mean certain death in those frigid waters. "We'll have to go around," Henry announced, already turning his horse. "There's another crossing 10 miles upstream, where the water runs slower." Della's face fell at the news, but she didn't complain. They followed Henry along a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest. The detour cost them precious hours, the sun climbing high overhead as they picked their way carefully along the steep path. Finally, they reached the second crossing. Here, the river spread wider and shallower, with thick ice extending from both banks. Henry tested it carefully, then led them across one at a time. The ice creaked ominously under their weight, but held. It was late afternoon when they crested the final ridge overlooking the county seat. The town sprawled across the valley floor, smoke rising from chimneys into the cold air. Elias raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "We'll approach careful like," he said. "Your stepfather might have men watching the roads." They dismounted and led their horses through a stand of scrub oak, staying out of sight. Henry pointed out fresh tracks in the snow. Several riders had passed this way recently. They waited until dusk began to settle before entering town, hoping the growing shadows would help conceal them. The courthouse stood at the end of the main street, its windows dark. Next door, a small house glowed with lamplight, the judge's residence. Elias tied his horse at the hitching post while Henry melted away into the shadows. Positioning himself to watch the street, Judge Merrick answered their knock promptly. He was a tall man with iron gray hair and keen eyes that took in every detail of their appearance. Unlike the whiskey-soaked Justice Penwell back in Gray Bluff, Merrick's gaze was sharp and clear. "Come in," he said, ushering them into his warm study. "I've heard troubling reports from up north." Elias explained their situation while Della sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. The judge listened intently, occasionally making notes. In a leather-bound book, "The deed's legal status is clear enough," Merrick said when Elias finished. "If your mother left it to you, properly witnessed and signed, your stepfather has no claim to it." He leaned forward in his chair. "But these matters require public ceremony to stick. A formal reading of the deed, witnessed by townsfolk of good standing, that would make it harder for him to act without consequences. But the deed... Della spoke up, her voice steady despite her obvious tension. "The real deed is still in Ma's trunk, back home. What I showed you last night was just a copy." Elias frowned. "You mean we have to go back there?" Della nodded. "The trunk has a false bottom. Stepfather never found it, though he turned the house upside down looking." She straightened her shoulders. "I know how to get to it. I can slip in through the root cellar while he's sleeping." Judge Merrick studied her thoughtfully. "It's risky, but necessary. Without the original document, your claim won't stand up to challenge." He closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Rest here tonight. I'll have my clerk draw up the necessary papers, and we'll deal with this first thing tomorrow morning." "Much obliged, Your Honor," Elias said, standing. The judge waved away his thanks. "I've seen too many good folks pushed off their land by men who think might makes right. The law exists to protect the weak from the strong, when we remember to use it properly." They spent the night in the judge's guest room, taking turns, keeping watch at the window. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Della sat on the edge of her bed, fingers tracing the warm cover of her mother's Bible. "Are you sure about this?" Elias asked quietly. "Going back there?" "I'm sure," she replied, her voice firm. "Ma always said being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what needs doing anyway. Dawn would bring its own challenges. But for now, They had a plan. Sometimes, Elias reflected, that was enough to keep hope alive through the darkest night. Gray light crept over the eastern horizon as three riders moved silently through the pre-dawn shadows. Elias led the way, keeping them well away from the known trails where stepfather's men might be watching. Henry rode drag, his keen eyes scanning their back trail for any sign of pursuit. Between them, Della huddled deeper into her coat against the biting cold. They stuck to the tree line, using patches of forest for cover. Snow muffled their horses' hooves, and their breath frosted in the still air. After 2 hours of careful riding, Della pointed to a small rise ahead. Just over that hill, she whispered. The homestead sat in a natural hollow, sheltered by cottonwoods. Smoke curled from the chimney, but no other signs of life stirred. They dismounted in a grove of pines, leaving Henry with the horses while Elias and Della crept closer. "Looks empty," Elias murmured, studying the cabin through his spyglass. "Your stepfather must be in town." Della nodded, her face tight. "The trunk's in what used to be Ma's room." They approached the cabin cautiously. Inside, dust lay thick on every surface. Della's footsteps left clear prints as she led the way to a small bedroom. The trunk sat against the wall, its brass fittings dull with age. "Ma always said the best place to hide something was in plain sight," Della said, running her hands along the trunk's edges. Stepfather searched it a dozen times, but never found the false bottom. Elias worked the rusty lock open with his knife. The trunk's hinges creaked as they lifted the lid. Inside lay folded quilts and faded dresses, carefully preserved. Della moved them aside, revealing the wooden bottom. Her fingers found a hidden catch and a section of the base lifted away. Just then, Henry's low whistle cut through the stillness. Hoofbeats approached from the north. "Riders coming," Henry called softly from his post at the window. 4 of them. Della's hand shook as she reached into the hidden compartment. She pulled out a leather folder, brittle with age. Inside, the deed's careful script confirmed her mother's gift. The land belonged to Della Mae Carter, witnessed and signed proper. "Got it," she breathed. The sound of horses grew louder. Henry's voice carried urgency now. "Time to go." They slipped out the back door as riders clattered into the yard. Della clutched the deed to her chest as they ran for the horses. Behind them, a shout went up. They had been spotted. "Ride!" Elias commanded, swinging into his saddle. They plunged into the pines, snow spraying from their horses' hooves. Shots cracked through the morning air, but the trees provided cover. Henry led them down a steep draw, following a game trail he had spotted earlier. The pursuit crashed through the forest behind them. Della's horse stumbled in deep snow, but she kept her seat. They burst out of the trees onto a frozen creek, ice gleaming in the early light. "Cross here," Henry called. "Ice should hold if we spread out." They guided their mounts onto the slick surface, moving carefully. The ice creaked and popped beneath them. Behind them, their pursuers emerged from the tree line. "They're following," Della gasped. "Good," Henry said grimly. Ice might not hold for all of them at once. As if in answer, a sharp crack split the air. Their pursuers had bunched up at the creek's edge. One horse went down, thrashing in the breaking ice. The others pulled up short, unwilling to risk the crossing. Elias and his companions made it to the far bank and didn't slow down. They rode hard for another hour, putting distance between themselves and their followers. Finally, Henry pointed out a rocky outcrop that would provide shelter and a good view of their back trail. They made camp in its lee, out of the wind. While Della tended the horses, Elias and Henry gathered firewood and set up a lean-to using pine boughs. The deed stayed safe in Della's coat pocket, close to her heart. "They'll try again," Henry said quietly as they worked. "Your stepfather's not the type to give up easy." Elias nodded, checking his rifle. "We'll take turns watching. Get some rest while you can, both of you." He took first watch, settled against a boulder where he could see both approaches to their camp. The winter sun climbed higher, but brought little warmth. In this shelter, Della and Henry slept fitfully, wrapped in their blankets. Elias studied the distant trail through his spyglass, knowing their respite wouldn't last long. The deed was only the first step. They still had to get it safely to Judge Merrick. His fingers traced the stock of his rifle as he kept his vigil, ready for whatever might come. Dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in pale gold as three riders emerged from their sheltered camp. Elias led them onto the main road, knowing speed mattered more than stealth now. The deed rode secure in Della's coat, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Their horses' hooves kicked up powder as they pushed through the drifts. "Town's about 4 hours ahead if we keep this pace," Henry called from the rear, his voice carrying over the crunch of snow. They rode steadily, stopping only briefly to water the horses at a half-frozen stream. Della's face showed strain from the hard riding, but she didn't complain. The morning wore on as they followed the winding road through stands of pine and across open meadows. Just before noon, the county seat came into view below them, a proper town with painted buildings and a real courthouse. Relief flickered across Della's features at the sight. But as they rounded the final bend, 5 riders appeared ahead, spread across the road. Elias reined up sharply. In the center sat a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, his eyes hard beneath the brim of his hat. Della's breath caught. "That's him," she whispered. "My stepfather. Stepfather." The man urged his horse forward a few steps. "Well, if it ain't my darling girl, come home at last." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Hand her over, Boone. This ain't your business." "She ain't property to hand over," Elias replied evenly. "And?" "That land you're after belongs to her, legal and proper." The stepfather's face darkened. "That land's mine by right. I worked it while her mama was dying. This ungrateful child needs to learn respect." "Respect?" Della's voice shook with anger. "You beat Ma's dog to death, just to hurt her. You sold her good china for whiskey money. The only thing you respect is yourself. Shut your mouth, girl." The stepfather spurred his horse forward, hand moving to his gun. Henry's rifle cracked like thunder. Snow exploded from a tree trunk just above the stepfather's head. The horses reared and shied, their riders fighting for control. In the chaos, Elias shouted, "Now!" They spurred their mounts forward, driving through the gap that opened between the startled riders. Shots rang out behind them, but they were already galloping hard for the courthouse, hooves thundering on the packed snow of the street. People scattered as they clattered to a stop at the courthouse steps. Elias helped Della down, and they rushed inside, Henry covering their rear. They found Judge Merrick in his office, looking up startled from his papers. "Your Honor," Elias said quickly, "we need an immediate hearing. Girl's stepfather is trying to steal her inherited land. We have the deed." Merrick took in their snow-covered clothes and urgent faces. He nodded sharply and stood, pulling on his black robe. "Main courtroom, now." Word spread through town like wildfire. By the time Merrick took his seat at the bench, the courtroom was filling with curious townsfolk. Della stood straight-backed beside Elias, the deed clutched in her hands. Henry positioned himself near the door, rifle resting casual but ready across his arm. The main doors burst open. The stepfather strode in, face dark with rage, his men crowding in behind him. "I demand you turn over my stepdaughter. She's under my legal guardianship." Judge Merrick's gavel cracked against the desk. "You'll demand nothing in my courtroom. Sir, take your seat or be removed." His voice carried the weight of law and steel. "This is a proper hearing regarding land ownership, and we will proceed in an orderly fashion." The stepfather's jaw worked, but he sat, his men clustering behind him like storm clouds. Merrick adjusted his spectacles. "Now then, young lady, approach the bench with your documentation." Della walked forward, her steps steady despite the tension. Filling the room, she handed over the deed, watching anxiously as Merrick examined it. "This appears properly executed," he said after a moment. "Witnessed and recorded by the previous circuit judge. The land in question was deeded specifically to Della Mae Carter upon her mother's death." He looked up. "Do you have any evidence to counter this claim, sir?" The stepfather surged to his feet. "She's a child. She can't manage land. I'm her legal guardian, and I say—" "You say nothing," Merrick cut in. "The deed is explicit. The land belongs to Miss Carter. Furthermore, ... He fixed the stepfather with a stern gaze. "I find your claim of guardianship questionable at best, given reports of your treatment of this young woman." Murmurs rippled through the crowded courtroom. Della stood straighter, strength flowing into her spine as she watched her stepfather's face turn purple with thwarted rage. Judge Merrick's voice filled the room. "This court recognizes Della Mae Carter's full ownership of the property in question. Any interference with her claim will be met with the full force of territorial law." His gavel cracked again. "Take your seats, everyone. We're not finished." "Here." Judge Merrick settled into his chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. The packed courtroom fell silent as he cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, please approach and state your claim to this property." Della stepped forward, her new calico dress rustling softly. The deed trembled slightly in her hands, but her voice rang clear. "This land was my mama's dream, Your Honor. She worked every inch of that creek bottom, planting an orchard and keeping a vegetable patch that fed half the valley." She paused, steadying herself. Before she passed, she made sure this deed was properly written up, saying the land would be mine when I turned 16. "Lies!" Her stepfather lurched to his feet, face mottled red. "That land was promised to me. I worked." Judge Merrick's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "One more outburst, sir, and you'll be removed." His stern gaze swept the room. "Continue, Miss Carter." Della squared her shoulders. Mama knew what kind of man she'd married. She wanted to make sure I'd have something of my own, a place where I could make my way. She held out the deed. "It's all here, signed proper with witnesses." Merrick examined the document carefully, holding it up to the light streaming through the courthouse windows. "Indeed. This appears to be an order, drawn up by Judge Harrison before his retirement." He looked up. "Do we have any witnesses present who can speak to the circumstances of this deed's creation or to Miss Carter's character?" Henry Tall Elk rose slowly from his seat, his weathered face dignified. "I knew Sarah Carter, the girl's mother. Helped her plant those first apple trees." His quiet voice carried authority. She spoke often of securing her daughter's future. Said her new husband had a wandering eye for property that wasn't his. The stepfather's hands clenched into fists, but the presence of armed townsfolk kept him in his seat. The traveling preacher stood next. "I can speak to Miss Carter's character, Your Honor. Since finding shelter with Mr. Boone, she's shown herself to be hardworking and God-fearing. Regular at services, helping with the children's Bible reading." He smiled kindly at Della. Her mother would be proud. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Several townspeople nodded, remembering Sarah Carter's gentle ways and her daughter's recent transformation from a scared girl in borrowed clothes to a young woman standing tall. Judge Merrick studied the deed once more, then looked directly at Della's stepfather. "The documentation is clear. This land was legally deeded to Della Mae Carter by her mother, with proper witnesses and filing." His voice hardened. "Furthermore, I find disturbing evidence of attempts to deprive Miss Carter of her rightful inheritance through intimidation and force." The stepfather surged up again. She's just a girl. She can't manage. Silence. Merrick's gavel crashed down. Miss Carter has demonstrated more maturity in these proceedings than you, sir. This court recognizes her as the sole and rightful owner of the property in question. He fixed the stepfather with a steel-hard stare. Let me be absolutely clear. Any attempt to interfere with Miss Carter or her property will result in immediate arrest and imprisonment. Do you understand? The stepfather's face twisted with impotent rage as he looked around the courtroom. Armed townsmen stood along the walls, hands resting meaningfully on their gunbelts. Henry's rifle lay ready across his lap. Elias stood like a mountain beside Della, his eyes never leaving her stepfather's face. Do you understand? Merrick repeated, each word falling like a hammer. Yes, the stepfather spat. Then we're done here. Merrick's gavel fell one final time. This court recognizes and confirms Della Mae Carter's ownership of the property described in this deed. Any challenges must be made through proper legal channels. He gave Della a gentle smile. The deed will be recorded in the county books, young lady. You may rest easy. The stepfather's men slunk toward the door, shoulders hunched under the hostile stares of the townsfolk. Their leader remained rooted in place, face dark with fury, until one of his hands tugged his sleeve. With a last venomous glare at Della, he turned and stalked out. Della's hand shook as she accepted the deed. Back from Judge Merrick. Alias's strong hand settled on her shoulder, steadying her. Around them, townspeople were standing, offering congratulations and welcome. The preacher beamed. Henry nodded in quiet satisfaction. The ride home stretched long under pewter-gray skies. Della held the deed close, tucked safe inside her coat, still hardly believing it was real. They stopped at Henry's camp, where pine smoke curled up through snow-laden branches. Much obliged, Elias said, clasping Henry's weathered hand. Couldn't have done this without you. Henry's eyes crinkled. The girl has her mother's spirit. Good to see justice done. He pressed a small bundle wrapped in deerskin into Della's hands. Dried berries, for sweetening your tea. Della's eyes misted. Thank you, Mr. Tall Elk, for everything. The rest of the journey passed in comfortable silence. When they reached the cabin, evidence of the break-in still marred their home. Scattered furs, overturned furniture, the ugly message carved into the door. Elias stood in the doorway, studying the damage. Reckon we could use that old shedwood for something better than storing trouble. He glanced at Della. If you're willing to help tear it down. She nodded, already imagining possibilities. Could build something new, something useful. Over. The next days, they rode into town with tools and determination. Plank by weathered plank, they dismantled the shed where Elias had first found her. Some boards were warped, others solid beneath their gray exterior. They sorted them carefully, loading the best onto their sledge. What you want to build? Elias asked one morning as they worked. Della paused, wiping sawdust from her face. A chicken coop, maybe. Could sell eggs in town, have some for ourselves. She hesitated. You think that's sensible? Reckon that's right practical thinking. His approval warmed her more than the winter sun. They worked steadily, sharing the labor as they'd learned to do. Each evening brought them home to their snug cabin, where soup bubbled on the stove and lamplight glowed against clean windows. The carved thread on the door began to fade under fresh wood oil and daily care. Snow still fell most days, but now it felt like a blanket rather than a barrier. Their suppers were quiet affairs, punctuated by the comfortable sounds of spoons against bowls and the crack of wood in the stove. Sometimes Della would hum a hymn while washing up, and Elias would listen, his face peaceful in the lamplight. The shed's wood, once a shelter for her desperation, was slowly transforming into something new, like hope taking shape. One reclaimed board at a time, spring painted the mountains with fresh green. warming the valley after the long winter. The morning sun caught golden glints in the new chicken wire as Della scattered feed for her busy flock. A dozen hens scratched and clucked, pecking at corn while their eggs waited in neat rows inside, ready for market. The scent of frying bacon and fresh biscuits drifted from the cabin's open door. Inside, Della moved confidently between stove and table, her apron dusted with flour. 3 miners sat waiting, their faces eager as she served up heaping plates. "Best breakfast this side of Denver," one declared, shoveling in eggs. The others nodded agreement, too busy eating to speak. Elias leaned in the doorway, a quiet smile beneath his graying beard. Gone was the wary girl he'd found in that tumble-down shed. In her place stood a young woman who carried herself with pride, who met folks' eyes directly and smiled often. "More coffee, Mr. Hanson?" Della offered the pot with a steady hand, her own blue cup steaming nearby. The miners left coins on the table and thanks in their wake, heading out to their claims with full bellies. Later that afternoon, Elias and Della rode into Gray Bluff together. Their horses' hooves kicked up dust where snow had lain so deep months. Before, they dismounted at the empty lot where the shed had stood. Now just a patch of bare earth between buildings. Elias squinted in the bright light. Hard to believe it was just sitting here, looking like nothing but trouble and old boards. "And you paid $1 whole for it," Della said, her eyes twinkling. She smoothed her clean calico dress, so different from the warm clothes she'd had then. "Guess you got more than you bargained for." "The best dollar I ever spent." His voice was gruff with feeling. "Found me a daughter I didn't know I needed." Della's breath caught at the word daughter. She blinked hard, remembering those first desperate days, how far they'd come since then. The trust built slowly over shared work, quiet suppers, and standing together against threats. Family, not by blood, but by choice. They mounted up for home, riding easy under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The spring air carried scents of sage and new grass. Ahead, the mountains stood proud against the horizon, their snow-capped peaks catching the afternoon light. Della breathed deep, feeling the warmth of belonging settle in her chest. No more hiding in shadows or fearing heavy footsteps. She had a home now, a future bright with possibility. And beside her rode the man who'd given her both. $1 worth of grace that had changed everything. The trail stretched before them, leading back to their cabin where hens clucked in their sturdy coop and the dinner fire waited to be lit. 2 unlikely souls, brought together by chance and bound now by something stronger than blood. The choice to become family. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.